magic is, so that's still there. All right, wonderful. Well, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. So I'm just gonna take a couple minutes of your time to tell you a story about this Clementine. And for some of you who may not know what a Clementine is just a type of tangerine. So I'm gonna tell you this story that is not mine. It was told to me when I was very little. So it's very interesting how a fruit so tiny can be so important to a family's history. My grandfather was born in the United States to Irish immigrants who were raging alcoholics. And they had left their home country of Ireland to escape poverty and famine, only to live in the United States, to be surrounded in this town, in this country of plenty, and being unable to afford anything. So imagine walking down the street and seeing bread that you can't buy, or seeing milk that you can't drink because you can't afford it. So after a while, my great-grandparents realized that they could no longer take care of my grandfather or his 3 brothers. So they abandoned them at an orphanage to be raised by Catholic nuns. And along the way, I don't know years, I don't know time-wise, but along the way he ended up losing his brothers through adoption, and my grandfather was left behind. And I know this because whenever my grandfather talks about Christmas, it's always really sad, and it's always really lonely. And he tells me about Christmas, and he tells me about the cold concrete halls and the empty rooms and the nuns walking down the corridor like ghosts, just black forms. And needless to say, nuns are not very affectionate human beings. And I don't think my grandfather was ever hugged as a child. So every Christmas, he would be there by himself, and he would get 2 pairs of clean white socks, a pair of underwear, a handful of walnuts, and a clementine. And he would get that every year for the next 12 years until he turned 18 and was forced out of the orphanage. And of course, after he was forced out of the orphanage, he did not have very much experience, so he did a bunch of odd jobs. He worked on boats, he was a janitor, he would scrape gum out from underneath bar stools, he did all kinds of things. But at the age of 18, something really wonderful happened to him, and he met my grandmother. Now, the other thing that you have to understand is my grandmother also came from a very beautifully tragic background. Her parents were from Alsace-Lorraine. They were also immigrants, and her father was coincidentally a raging alcoholic. Got some good family genes here. So much so that on the night of her prom, the night when my grandfather fell madly in love with my grandmother, he went to pick her up in this old jalopy piece of crap car. And upon walking up to the front door, noticed that her father was passed out drunk in the bushes. And he took my grandmother's hand. She started crying a little bit, and he just escorted her to the car. And in that moment, my grandfather felt very brave, because he could take her away from this. And then he opened the car door. And as I said, this was a really crappy little car, so much so that, so he tells me this story, and as a child, I believe it, but as an adult, I realize it's not physically possible. And he says that the car was so bad that it was missing the floor of the car. So, like in a Flintstones cartoon, right? And as a kid, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's how cars work, right? As an adult, you're like, there's no way that's possible. But he tells me this, and he says how he was so embarrassed, right? Like to escort my grandmother dressed in this beautiful dress that her mother had made, and having to tell her like, okay, you have to, prop your feet up on the side, so when the car starts, you won't get in. Like her having to ball up her dress into her lap as they're driving, and the whole thing is just shaking. And they pull up to the parking lot of the high school, and people can hear them coming from miles away. This thing just sounds like a tornado of car parts and machines rubbing against each other like they shouldn't be. And they come pulling up. There's this horrible screeching sound, and everybody turns and looks. The other thing is they're from a very small town, so there's all of like 20 people that they go to high school with, and all 20 of them turn and stare, and they all know about their backstory, right? They all know that my grandfather is the abandoned orphan, and they all know that my grandmother has this raging alcoholic father. And he pulls up, and he parks the car, and he's just sweating like crazy, and he's so embarrassed. And he gets out of the car, and he opens the door, and my grandmother is just this pure grace of a woman. She has her dress, all balled up in her lap, and she flings it back and just walks right in and grabs his hand and leads him into the dance. And in doing so, my grandfather just describes it as he doesn't remember. He doesn't remember what happened that night. He doesn't remember the car. He doesn't remember the people staring. All he remembers is that he was dancing with her for what felt like forever. And then 2 years later, they got married. They had 5 children who became amazing, amazing siblings to each other, who then became amazing aunts and uncles, who then became amazing parents themselves. And every single year, for all of us kids, all of us grandkids, my grandfather would always give us a handful of walnuts and a clementine. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized how important this silly little fruit was. Thank you.